Hello, and good afternoon. And my name is Merle McGee, and I am the president and CEO of Everyday Democracy, or as I like to say, the steward of this organization. And thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our Doing Democracy series, a virtual conversation series exploring how we build inclusive, participatory communities from the grassroots. Today's event, I'm so excited, is focused on remaking the commons, stories of civic space, belonging, and democracy. And as you know, this couldn't be more timely. But let me begin by saying, for more than 30 years, Everyday Democracy has engaged ordinary people in brave, inclusive, and substantive dialogue and collective decision-making to solve local problems. Our work began with community conversations, bringing everyday people together face to face to talk about what matters, make decisions together, take action. But what we've learned is that for dialogue and action to happen, people need a place to come together, somewhere that everyone can feel they have a seat at the table. And just as importantly, a place to return to, whether it's a local library, a neighborhood garden, or a rec center. Civic spaces are what keep us connected and momentum alive. And at Everyday Democracy, we continue to help communities create this kind of democracy through showing up in everyday life. We partner with local groups across the country to support dialogue, organizing, and collective action. We train and support people to lead civic projects locally that strengthen relationships and democracy right where they live. And we also work with institutions like libraries and museums to use their physical spaces as hubs for civic participation and dialogue. Now, if you're here today, there is a really good chance that you're already doing this work or are at least interested in doing this work, and perhaps even looking for more ways to do that. Whether you're a librarian, a youth organizer, a city official, or maybe a neighbor who simply cares and wants to be connected, we're here to support you. And of course, you'll find resources on our website that we'll drop in the chat today to help you follow up on how to continue staying connected and being connected during and after this conversation. As people who care about your communities, our neighbors, and the future we're building with and for each other, we know how vital civic spaces are. This is where strangers become neighbors, where we hear what matters locally, where we organize for change, where we exercise democracy and our most basic rights: to speak, to gather, to be seen, to be heard. These are not just buildings or plazas, they are the foundation for belonging, trust, and democratic possibility. But we're living in a moment when these spaces are under real threat. Across the country, we see divestment and restrictions eroding the public commons. More than 1 in 5 Americans live in communities where they have no access to public or commercial spaces like parks, libraries, or coffee shops, where they can simply show up and be in community. And another third have just 1 or 2 of those spaces aforementioned. That's half of the country with few or no places to connect with one another. Now, I can tell you as a New Yorker who's deeply involved in my own community, that was a hard one for me to imagine, but it's a reality for millions of people today. So our conversation today asks us to think about, what do we lose when civic spaces disappear? And what can we build when we create them? We are honored to be joined by two incredible leaders who are remaking civic space in real time. They'll share what these spaces offer, what they're up against, and what people need most right now, including concrete ways that they can all take part. But to start us off, I'd love to invite each of you listening and joining us from wherever you are today to reflect on the question, and we'll return to it throughout this conversation. But we want you to please share in our Q&A box what is a physical public space that helped you feel like you belonged? What is a physical space that helped you feel like you belong? And we are going to take a look at those responses as time goes on throughout our conversation. Now, I am beyond excited to welcome our two speakers. Joining us first is Shamichael Holman, the Director of Civic Engagement and Economic Opportunity at the Urban Libraries Council. Shamichael is an award-winning social, civic, and tech innovator, internationally renowned TEDx speaker, and the author of Meet Me at the Library, a place to foster social connection and promote democracy. Shamichael, welcome. I am also joined by the incredible Blue Kind, a visionary community leader and cultural entrepreneur. We're going to get into that, who founded multiple community spaces and organizations and grassroots locations across Philadelphia. Blue empowers other grassroots leaders and organizations through her board service and consulting work with Fannie Lou's Porch. We are going to talk about that porch. We want to thank the Urban Libraries Council, who is our co-sponsor for tonight's event. The Urban Libraries Council has spent more than 50 years championing public libraries as essential institutions for civic engagement. Beyond today's conversation, Everyday Democracy is proud to be a partner with Urban Libraries Council to train librarians across North America to lead community conversations on critical local issues, which we'll share more about that later on as well. Welcome, Blue. Welcome, Shamichael. So let's get started in this conversation. Blue, I'm going to ask you this question, but Shamichael, I'm going to ask you as well. And I always like to begin every conversation with, how are you? And in these times in particular, what's giving you hope right now?
I am doing well. I just taught children today, so I'm like excited to hang out with everybody. And what's bringing me hope is being with people. I see a lot of beauty in being with people and seeing that we all are just so beautiful, especially the children. And I'm also into getting in solitude and being in solitude and going to nature and spending a few days out in the woods, and getting in touch with my own humanness. So, yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that. And yes, the children. Shamichael, how are you? And what's giving you hope right now?
I'm doing pretty good. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me. I just got off a call with about 50 librarians from across the U.S.
Hey,
Different time.
Shamichael, can you lean in a little bit more to your mic? We're having some difficulty hearing you.
Sure, no problem at all. Yeah, so I'm doing quite well. I just got off a call with about 50 librarians from across the country, and man, those folks are really amazing. They're doing some incredible work, and I am getting a tremendous amount of hope and inspiration from them.
I love it. Yes, people doing the work and the critical work that a lot of times feels unseen, or I would say taken for granted. Thank you both. I'd really love to turn to the specific spaces that each of you have helped shape and the community needs that those spaces were responding to. So, Shamaiko, I'm going to ask you this. We know that libraries have long been public gathering spaces, and I'm sure everyone on this call has a moment, a memory of being in their school library, their local library. Maybe you were trying to figure out, if you're as old as me, the Dewey Decimal System, or trying to get some information that you needed, that you just sort of couldn't find in. All right, now I'm really dating myself. The Encyclopedia Britannica. um, but what I love to know, right, as we think about libraries, they've evolved into something more, right? More than at least what I recall as a child. Can you talk about the role of libraries and the roles they have played historically as civic spaces and what that looks like today? And
Mm.
of course, if you can share and weave in some examples of the historic Kazakh Library in Memphis, that would be a delight. I think it's a story people would want to know.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's such a great question that you've asked. When I think about the historical context of libraries, I first think about the library as a site of access, right? That it is and has been this place where people go to get access to knowledge and information. And the great people that meet folks, the librarians that do that work of helping make that information more accessible. I mean, even as you talk about the Dewey Decimal System, we know that there was the work of really amazing Black librarians who even challenged that system, to make it more inclusive and more open to folks. Also, think about the library as a site of protest, and I think as we can't talk about civic spaces without thinking about the role that protests, have in civic space. We can think about the library as a place that has always been a place of contestation, like, who gets to belong at the library, whether those are, African Americans in the Jim Crow South, whether that is the unhoused in today's environment, LGBTQ folks, right? And so I think about the library as this sort of site of protest, a site of sort of constantly trying to negotiate who gets access to the space, what stories are told, who gets to tell those stories, who gets to access those stories. Also think about the library, I think increasingly just, as a site of creativity and innovation. And this is really, one of the things that I love. And you asked me to talk about Memphis. Memphis is this really amazing city of music and soul and innovation. And one of the things that I really appreciate about their library system is how they are baking that into the day-to-day life of the library. One of the ways that they're doing that right now that I've been really loving is their Innovator in Residence program, where they're bringing folks from the communities, knowledge experts, subject matter experts, who are co-programming alongside librarians. And this is really, I think, doing an incredible work to uplift the cultural fabric of that city.
I love this idea of innovators in residence and co-creating with librarians. How powerful it is to literally invite community into space as co-creators and not just receivers of information. So I appreciate you lifting that up. Thank you so much, Michael. Blue, I want to turn to you, but first, if you're in our audience, I want to invite you to start putting questions you may have for our speakers in the Q&A box. You can do this at any time, and our team is going to save them and queue them up, and we'll have some time to get through a few questions as the conversation continues. So let's do our part to enliven the conversation. But first, I want to come back to Blue. Blue, can you share what community needs you were responding to when you created Franny Lou's Porch? And of course, you need to tell us what Franny Lou Porch is. And how did you design the physical and space and the programming to meet the needs of community? And how did that evolve during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Franny Lou's Porch is named after Frances E.W. Harper and Fannie Lou Hamer. And the porch is that in-between space of connection. And I really love that image. And I'm from the South as well, so I really like to bring some Southern hospitality to Philadelphia. Yes, and so when we started Franny Lou's, that's been a project that I started back in 2009. But we opened Franny Lou's in 2015. And then after all those years, I was like, yo, I really just want to make a space that centers marginalized folks to be seen, heard, and dream. And in order to dream, you have to be at peace, right? At rest and at a space of like all of our needs are met, right? So really creating this space for, Black, brown, queer families, children, elders to come to, that they can just like let go of that mask that we hold, or clenching the jaw. I mean, I don't know. I didn't realize how much I clenched my jaw when I was until I was recent. And I had TMJ growing up and everything. And I was like, oh, it was around holding back my voice in spaces that I was not centered or welcome. And so I was like, I really want to create this space where people don't have to do that. And so little things are big impacts, right? So let's say the music was all indigenous and Black and brown. So people would come in and be like, oh, I love this song. I remember when my grandma used to play this on the, the retro. I was like, yes, I know, right? So cool, right? And dancing was always accepted. Loudness is okay. There's a kids corner, and that's where the children can play and read about Black and brown authors. We had great programming in this space, but just the way that it was designed, the art was on the wall, was Black, brown, and local artists and vendors, and I just was very specific. Textiles were African print and ancestral. We had tin and dark wood in the space, and a lot of light and a lot of plants. When you go to your grandma's house, there's like all these plants. And even down to the names of our food and beverages, like we had the Angela Davis, the James Baldwin, the Cesar Chavez, right? We had these names of beverages that didn't correlate to their flavors, but it was really to tell their story and to say that their story is just like your story, and that we can create a space where your voice is heard here too. So answer a poll question, share some art on the wall. We had a little space where people used really nice materials and they could hang up their art or hang up their poems that they just wrote. And it was just creating spaces of conversation and connection. So it was a dream. So very thankful for that space.
Mm. And I love this idea of a place to be seen, heard, and dream. That civic spaces can be places in which we imagine and reimagine who we are in community, who we are as individuals in relationship to other people. And so I hope that as the conversation continues, we'll hear more, details about Franny Lou's porch and more about the work, Shamichael, that you've done with libraries and in the role that you have now in in urban libraries council and this important effort as we recognize that civic spaces are going to either be enabled or inhibited. And as we shared earlier in the conversation, 1 in 5 Americans live in communities where they have no access to public or commercial spaces, which could be like the Franny Lou porch of coffee shops and community places, or libraries, parks, where they can simply show up and be with one another. So this is where I think we need to probably make a distinction between public spaces, outside, as the kids would say, and civic spaces, and what really makes the difference. For us at Everyday Democracy, we define civic spaces as environments where people can come together and freely express their views, engage in dialogue, access information, organize, and advocate for their interests without fear or reprisal or undue interference. So it's not just about having a public space, being outside, but it's about what that space makes possible. And we know that historically, everyone hasn't had access to all of the civic spaces that we're talking about today. But we know that as we have been on this journey to build a multiracial democracy, that these kinds of spaces, libraries, right, community centers, are spaces that are invaluable for our ability to see and be seen in relationship to one another. Now, some of you may be familiar with Heather McGhee's book, The Sum of Us, where she talks about what happens after desegregation and the closing of so many civic spaces, pools, public pools, because people were struggling to be in relationship with all of their neighbors. So we know that it's not just about a public space, but it is about where people can feel welcome, safe, and empowered in those spaces that exist. So here's the question to both of you. As we think about enablers and inhibitors of civic space, how, and I'm sure people on this call are curious, how do you create civic spaces? And what has your experience taught you about how belonging is built in those spaces? So, Blue, if you could speak and with, examples, how you create civic spaces and what your experience has taught you about belonging, that would be mint.
Nice. Yes, I am always very aware that community is not a monoculture. So community is not even who I represent, Black woman, mother, Afro-Indigenous person. You know what I mean? I know that there's other people that represent different communities and that are all light. We're all light doing this thing, okay? Doing something, wanting good in the world. So I'm really into partnering with other organizations and leaders to hold things in my space, lead workshops, lead discussions, come having meetings in my space. I know with Franny Lou's, we were in the middle of 3 different high schools in Kensington. And it was dope to have, teachers come and rest on their break and share and just, talk to adults for a little bit, get out of their space. And so they can go back more rejuvenated. It was like clockwork. I mean, it was such a great, dope experience to see people, how they utilize the space and who we attracted. I would say having boundaries, not boundaries, what is it called? Community agreements on who you are and what to expect. We always within our staff, I was talking about this earlier, it was about, I really love to focus on our staff, our community behind the counter. Because if that person is representing this business when I'm not there, I can't be everybody. And so I'd also make sure to really hire diverse staff, right? So they can connect to different people. And I always hired people that love talking to others, eye contact, heart is up, going, who really, really value community. And within that staff, we had values of taking care of yourself, taking care of others, which is your community, and taking care of your team. So yourself was first. Period. So we were very gracious with each other on, emergencies, on needs that they had. And we supported each other creating these spaces. And so what happens if I just focus on my team, then they're going to share that to the community. They're going to reflect that also to our, customers and neighbors. What do you need? Is there anything we can help you with? This is what we got, and a little bit goes a long way with that. But yeah, and so that's how we really started. We originally started with an open mic, being a space where people could bring their words, and it was called Bring Your Words. And people would just share what was on their heart, and whatever it was accepted, even if you didn't like it. Even if you didn't like it. I just love that. Like, inviting discord is okay. We do not need to be the same. We can have questions, talk about it, create conversation, so we can actually lead with more understanding, of each other. And so I'm all about, hosting these types of events to gather community and really center marginalized people. Like, all of our books were Black and brown, and queer, because that's what we represented, Yeah, so I think that answered the question.
You sure did. And you got me thinking about something I think is really delightful in our pre-conversation I didn't think of, which is this idea of open mic, and maybe you don't like what someone is saying, but to practice democracy is to build the civic disposition of being able to tolerate difference and differing opinions around, or perspectives around, how we see and understand and make sense of the world. And I think that sometimes art is an incredible tool to help us do that, right? Because it feels, while maybe provocative in its artistic flow, it's a stealthy kind of way of forcing the individual to have a response to something that maybe they hadn't thought about before, or hadn't thought about it in that way before. So, just want to shout out to the artists who make us think, and who actually build our muscle for democratic processes, which is being in these spaces. All right, I'm going to stop yammering and turn to you, Sharmichael, and ask again, how do you create civic spaces? And what has your experience taught you about how belonging is built in those spaces?
Yeah, well, let me first say, I said this earlier, I do believe Blue was a librarian in a previous life, because her answer was just had library written all over it. But I want to go back to your definition of civic space. It was a pretty heavy definition, actually. And I hope that we don't gloss over it, because when we say that civic spaces are for people, I think we have to continue to ask ourselves, which people? And when we talk about being able to freely express, well, who gets to be able to freely express themselves? Or are we at a place right now in the US culture where everyone can actually freely express themselves? And then when I think about this other part of that definition of without fear, without fear of reprisal, again, I just sort of, I think in this moment that we should not gloss over that whether it's a park, a library, a community center, that we have to interrogate that question, and we have to be able to ask ourselves, do we really meet that criteria, right? I know within library land, we often say that we are a space for everybody, and we are, I believe. I truly believe that. I think a question that then follows that is, well, what happens if everybody shows up? What happens if every segment of the community shows up in your space at the same time? Because that's bound to bring with it some level of contradiction and conflict, right? But I also believe that it's also bound to bring with it some level of beauty and collaboration. And that often comes down to how we then receive individuals, how we treat individuals, and our sort of level of capacitance to even be able to deal with the public. Because if we are a public space, we have to really wrestle with the fact that the public will show up, if we set the conditions. Now, I do believe also, sort of follow that up, that there are a set of values, and Blue spoke these. There are a set of values that I think underline, or that should underline, any civic space. These values of equal access, right? These values of democratic or maybe civic engagement, how we bring people into the process, how we do things with and not for people, right? In this sort of diversity of opportunity, like what's who gets to hold the mic, who gets to tell the story, who gets to do the thing. But I think where we are right now, and I don't hope not, I'm not getting too philosophical here, but I think particularly in this moment in time, there are two more values that we really should find ways to lift up. And one of those is social economic mixing. The reality is that the way that many of our communities are designed, so many people never have the opportunity to even come in contact, to be able to develop friendships with people who are very different than them, who are of a different race, who are of a different income level, right? Who are of a different social, ethnic, or racial background. And so I think these things have to undergird any sort of space that we are trying to build or that we are trying to develop. And then, of course, as you have talked about, this how do we then take those values and layer on spaces of belonging? How do we get to this place of belonging within civic spaces? I've been really, encouraged and really inspired to see the ways that libraries do this. And I think libraries do this in a couple of ways that I love to just lift up very quickly. I think one of the really essential ways libraries do this is by meeting essential needs, right? That there are people, when if there are any library workers that are on this call, library managers, people who have worked in a branch in any sort of way, you recognize that when you open the door at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock in the morning, anybody could come through those doors, right? And they may have a variety of different needs, right? Like, certainly we want to give them access to books and to knowledge and information, but sometimes people need food. Sometimes they need clothing. Sometimes they need just to be able to refresh themselves. And it's been great to see. There was a library in Las Vegas, the Las Vegas Clark County, Las Vegas library system that did an incredible work of creating a cell phone lending program for unhoused individuals. And the phone was loaded with everything that they might need, every contact that they might need, right? I think there's an incredible thing there. And this is one way. I also believe just more increasingly, one of the most important things that libraries can do is not only introduce people to books, but to also introduce people to other people, right? And I've been again very encouraged by the ways, I talk a lot about this library in Grand Junction, Colorado, the Mesa County Library System, and how they hosted this human library where they curated about 15 human books. People that were on the margins, trans individuals, folks who were returning from the justice system, folks who just, who some people in life might say, oh, that's just not my cup of tea right there. And within this library on a Sunday afternoon, people from the community got to come in and check out these individuals and sit down and have a conversation and say, tell me about your life. Tell me what it's like. I don't want to assume what it's like for you to be your life. Tell me what it's like to live in your shoes, to exist as you exist. And it was just this really powerful moment to see not only people having an opportunity to share their story, but also for people to hear the lived experience of other people. And so I think about civic spaces. I think these are some of the things that are at the forefront of the opportunity that's in front of us right now.
I love the Human Library. I'm familiar with the Human Library Project and the power of that. And, you know, you raised something I thought was a really important question. What happens when the public shows up? Right? And not just the public that you perceive as
exactly
the public or deserving or worthy, and are you prepared for that as a space? Because, you know, I recently had an experience at a local historical society, and you know, I'm there looking at an incredible exhibit on Indigenous people in the region, and you know, I might call it accosted, but you know, perhaps this individual just was looking for community to work through his own feelings about what this history was sharing, and perhaps what the implications of that history was for him as a person now living generations later in this community. And I think, you know, my initial reaction was like, oh, right? But if the work of being together is actually being together, um, then there is an import that we must, you know, put towards what does it mean to bring community and everyone into that space, and that there is a place for everyone, even those folks who may not necessarily see that they want a place because they want something differently. And I think you're right about, you know, the library's opportunity here around social economic mixing, because I think that the economic differences that people experience in our society are honestly a mystery to each other.
Sure.
You know, there's a glimpse of a window through, you know, some media version of a thing, but we don't really have a sense of each other across social class. And I would say this is true across race and gender and other markers of identity, religion, you know, and so on and so forth.
Sure.
But that these civic spaces have a really important and heavy lift if they are trying to answer that question, what happens when the community shows up?
Absolutely. And I would add two things. I would add that there are probably some individuals who hear this and say, well, I think that's beyond the role of the library. And I would push back and say, okay, well, then do you want to be a space where everyone comes or not? Right? Because if you want to be that space where everyone shows up, I think you have to engage in that work. And I would say maybe kind of adding to that, it is still the truth that the public library as an institution in this country is still one of the most trusted spaces. It's a space where people still feel like they can actually show up. And because people do feel that way, I think it is a burden. It is an opportunity for the library to really lean into that. I will say lastly, this idea of, you know, what happens when everyone shows up, I sincerely believe that it comes down to the people who are at the front desk, who are at the front door, the people who manage the park ranger, the park, right? Like and Blue has already talked about this, like, and how she trains her staff. It really is the staff that can make a break. And as I was researching the book, I came across this other book that I do want to lift up because I believe everyone who is in public space should take a look at it. It is a book called Hopeful Visions, Practical Actions, written by 3 librarians at the University of New Mexico. And they really look at what does cultural humility look like in library work. But I think it really translates across any type of public space, whether you are a bookstore, a coffee shop, a park, if you're managing or trying to activate alleyways or plazas, the principles apply regardless.
Thank you so much. And I know the team is holding on to all of the suggested resources as a part of this conversation, and people will have access. I'm deeply appreciative. I want to move into what we've kind of been dancing around, which is this question, right? If everyone shows up or we don't all care for what was being offered in a spoken word piece, what does it mean to hold and navigate disagreement, discomfort, and conflict, right? And those things are different. Disagreement, discomfort, and conflict. We know that holding space in civic life means that we're going to have to navigate those things, and sometimes it does feel risky, and especially as we are, constantly hearing about the fissures of polarization that keep, deepening and widening, as the nation is sort of grappling with itself and who we are, who we've been, and who we want to become. And so the question for me goes to you, Blue, first. You've created open and welcoming spaces that everyday people and small business, as an everyday person and a small business owner, how have you approached holding space for difference and sustaining openness when disagreement or conflict arises?
Well, I think it's you first have to tackle your belief system around conflict. I think everything is an opportunity. It's interesting. I feel something in my heart when someone says this. Being self-aware of how information affects your body and knowing that people are just triggering our little child inside. And I think we need, and their little children as well. So really checking in with ourselves on our own veils of prejudice or othering that we have, and getting to know ourselves on a more human level. I can only speak as a Black woman in this country on how I had to dehumanize myself so much to actually plow through and get through stuff. And that gives me allowance to dehumanize others, right? So getting to understand who we are as humans that make mistakes, make decisions, and have opinions. So you can be open to hear others' opinions, right? So that's, I think, number one. The next is strategy, right? Whenever I hire people, I'm just always like, here's our conflict resolution process. You first deal with it on your end. If you don't like it, if you don't feel right, you go to the manager. If the manager does not feel right in the situation, you go to me. And then if I don't feel right, guess what? I have a board of people that, and so people are like, oh, it's Franny Lou's Porch, a nonprofit. It's like, nah, but I'm a community space. So I'm going to have a leadership of community members who live in the neighborhood, who are older than me or younger than me, who have different, connections than I do. In certain situations, right? So I can have some more perspective myself on how to deal with things in a loving way. I still have boards. I know I'm like even thinking of like creating like a board for these businesses to use because we need guidance, right? And I don't think that I know everything. So having that and also training, I did, what is that? We did training, so de-escalations training, for our staff and for ourselves. I'm always about really investing in professional development, even if you're a little coffee house. You know what I mean? And I think there is a difference in the cafe world of community cafes and cafes, where I think community cafes are the ones that have the refrigerator outside, have the, kids corner in the books, where cafes are a little more, I would call them white culture spaces in my language. But so creating these, guidances of, strategy, of humanness, then you can create ways of how you connect to others. So I would never, say somebody comes in and they can never come in again. Okay. I had a shop and there was a lot of, users, a lot of prostitution. I had my space broken into and all my spoons were gone. All electronics were still there. You know what I'm saying? It was like, at the end of the day, we're all in pain in some way, whether we show it on the outside or we keep it at home and shut the door. So my pain is not greater than your pain, and how you express it is your way of expressing it. But how can we coexist here? How can we have some boundaries? How can you come into my shop? Please do not take all the sugar. I love you. I would say, I love you. I have other people. Or, please don't sleep in please don't sleep in the store because that's against my brand. I'm a coffee house. You're welcome to rest on one of my benches outside. I didn't, if you were chilling, you were chilling. If you were harmless, you were harmless. And I think everybody is deserved to be seen. So I know a lot of cafes like, I don't want them chilling. I'm like, they're hanging out and just connecting. You are not on their socioeconomical space, but they're not doing any harm. And that's my really big, it's like harm, like physical harm, like harassing. I've had to ask people to leave for like 3 months at a time if, you're making my customer feel uncomfortable or making my staff feeling uncomfortable. Like you're staring at their breasts, dude, you need to stop. This is the third time that I've told you to stop. So now you cannot come in the store for 3 months. And I'm talking about like a 60-year-old white man in my space. And so I would have to come and talk to these people. But guess what? When I had boundaries, when I communicated boundaries of conflict with people, what it is I gained respect. And over the years, those same people that I had boundary with, they were, regulars again, or they respected me in other spaces. They always looked out for the store and they would call me if something was up, So I think letting go of that fear of like protecting too, I'm protecting the space that we're all safe here. We're all safe, even you. And like coming with that like energy is just, it's light, you know what I mean? And it's attractive and it's beautiful. So that's how I've been able to like really keep that love center, but keep that mama bear and keep the reality of what is coming and really caring for the space. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you for that. And, in a loving way really resonates because you're offering a reckoning, right? You're offering an opportunity for people to make it right in a loving way, a way that doesn't dispose of people, right? And if we say we believe that all people are welcome, then no one is disposable. And that's as Shamichael said, a tall order, right? Because that really requires the strategy, right? And the disposition and the value set in order to be able to do that effectively. So, Shamichael, I want to turn to you and ask you. I know that when you've leaned in, that you've leaned into civic dialogue as a part of library programming. Can you tell me what it looked like in practice? And especially if you have an example of how you handled when conflict or difference showed up in that space as you were, leaning into this programming.
Yeah, well, I want to go back one more time to what Blue said. And again, I do believe that Blue was a librarian in the previous life, because everything that she said about harm, it marries and blends over quite well to the library space. So I won't revisit what she said about harm. But Marie, you lifted up a couple of other words that I think are worth wrestling with, one being conflict, but the other being discomfort. And I think that word discomfort is something that's worth us talking about. Like it can be uncomfortable to have to sit with somebody who has an opposing political view. It can be uncomfortable to have or to be invited into having dialogue, about race or gender or inequality. There's not a harm happening there. That's just a little bit of discomfort. And I think the opportunity that we have as civic spaces is to help people lean into some of that discomfort, right? To give people the tools and, as you have said, the strategies to be able to work through some of the discomfort. This country is continuing to become more and more diverse, right? And so we have to be able to help people live within that. Now, within the library space, I've seen this play out in a number of ways. Personally, for a number of years, I hosted an event in libraries called Civic Saturdays. And Civic Saturdays were essentially a civic analog to a Sunday morning church service. It worked very well for me because I was a former pastor. So I knew how to make this happen in the South, right? And in these gatherings, we reflected on, what does it mean to be a citizen? What does it mean for us to show up as Memphians? What does it mean for us to wrestle with the fact that some neighborhoods, there's some inequality, that there's some neighborhoods where the infant mortality rate is a little bit higher, that there's some neighborhoods where the school systems underperform, right? And it's by no accident that in some of these same neighborhoods, there are plants and factories that are spewing chemicals into the air, into the soil, into the water, right? And those questions, those conversations, what I have found from a dialogue perspective, and I do want to sort of bring in our partnership here, but what I have found from those perspectives is not to go in directly to accusing, some group of people or some race of people about the conditions that exist in the neighborhood. We can instead talk about what are the dreams that we all have for our kids. We all want our kids to be educated in a good school system. We all desire our kids to be able to walk the street from school to home, to the library, to the park, and not get hit because there's not a sidewalk, right? And it's often in those sorts of ways that you're able to diffuse conversations. But as you said earlier, we have just entered into this beautiful partnership where we're going to be training 50 librarians, and I hope that we get resources to do even more in your multi-partial facilitation process. And I think this is just going to be a game changer for so many of our library systems to begin thinking about, what does it look like for the library to be a site of dialogue, a site of discourse, and to have a process and a strategy and a means to do this in a way where we really are lifting up our communities. There is, there's research actually that came out a couple of months ago from More in Common that said that people, even as polarized and as divided that we are, people do still desire to come together across difference. Not so much on the political spectrum, but if they can come together to do something together, to make their community better, to talk about an issue that affects all of them, people still actually have a hunger for that. And I'm really looking forward to the ways that our partnership is going to help libraries be that space.
I love that. I love this piece around what happens when we root or ground ourselves in our common desire for a dignified existence, right? And how powerful that is for a conversation to be had with people. So, and such a powerful foundation, because we can all agree that we want, what's
absolutely.
best for ourselves and our loved ones.
Well,
Most people, I should say, can agree.
Yes. I was coming to I said most people, for sure, for sure. But
That's a different conversation.
Yeah, and I'll also say that for those people that we should not force those people into conversation. Right?
Exactly.
We find the people that are willing to have that conversation and we build from there, right? And we hope that those people will ultimately be willing to come to we always keep the table open for those people to come, but we don't force those people to come to the table. We can't make people change their mind. We can set the conditions where people build a shared affinity, mutual bonds of affection for each other, and see what comes from that, I believe. And so, as you all do so effectively, give people the tools and the strategies to be able to talk things out.
So what I'm hearing is we can set the table, but we can't let people turn the table over.
Amen.
Okay, fair enough. All right.
Unless we need to be checked.
And okay,
I'm just saying.
That's fair.
I'm just saying, because that needs to be open too. Because sometimes, you know, as the institution, as the business, sometimes you're not right. And it's okay. You know, like in that moment, it's probably coming from something, history and whatever is coming. But, you know, we're not perfect either. That's all. We're not perfect. And I learned so much just from the children, right? I learned so much from others. So I think keeping that constant desire to learn and not know everything is extremely non-American, but it is extremely rooted in wanting community to exist, right? If I'm who I ought to be, then you are who you ought to be, MLK, you know?
You know, and I love this piece around institutions, recognizing, right, that institutions haven't always served everyone in the same way. And when those institutions have been called to be accountable, because that's what I hear you calling for, is accountability, that there is an obligation for institutions. And, you know, I like to say institutions are really just a collective or of people. The people are the institutions. Institutions they don't exist outside of the people. Having the humility to be open to more possibilities, more love, more connection, more community, right? And that is a powerful invitation, and one that can be quite scary inside of particularly institutions that you love or that you have been responsible for designing and creating. And you have a vision about how that should go. But with authority comes not only responsibility, but accountability. Okay, so let's get to what can we do? But before I open up, right, to questions from our attendees, I do want you to remember to put your questions in the chat. But I want to pause on something that's at the heart of the conversation. What can we do, each of us, to create and sustain civic spaces where we live? At the start of this conversation, we asked you to reflect on the question, what is a physical public space that helped you feel like you belonged? Let's take a look at what you shared. Now, is this a setup? Did you all know we were talking about libraries today? But how incredibly powerful libraries are. Parks, right? The beach, schools, schoolyards, right? The kinds of places, museums, centers, places of worship represented as church. You know, the field, like these places where we move together as small micro communities that have the possibility of radiating out into larger, right, community spaces of belonging, connection. That's very powerful. Very, very powerful. So these responses, are a reminder that civic spaces aren't abstract. They're real places in our lives, right? Full of meaning, familiar, and full of possibility. And each one of these sites where connection care and and gathering are places where democratic life can take root. So just want to remind you all, drop your questions in the chat, but we're going to move to what is our last formal question before we open it up to our audience. And that is, what advice would you give to ordinary people, everyday people, whether they're running a library, cafe, or simply hoping to create more civic connection in their neighborhood? What advice do you have? What's one small step someone can take to help foster community and democratic possibility and practice democratic skills? Shamichael?
Yeah, I'm as I was reflecting on that prompt that you first put into the chat, my mind went to not a library, actually went to the park. It went to the park for me during the COVID-19 pandemic was the only place that I could go. And it provided green space, which was helpful for me. There was a small pond there that I could sort of at least be near some water. And it was in that space where, I would run or jog and I might just see the person that I'm going at the same time every day, to do my run or do my walk, got my mask on even outside, right? Because we were all sort of concerned at that point in time. But just to see a smiling face was really helpful, right? To have someone acknowledge my presence in this space was really helpful. And so I think I'm not even thinking about like the institution right now. I'm just thinking about what does it mean for us as individuals to show up for each other, and how we might do that. And so I think I would say that, like, just be mindful of what it is for all of us to exist in this moment right now, this moment in time, which there's so much that's happening on so many levels. Just how do we continue to show up for each other?
Blue, what advice do you give people that are trying to create more civic connection in their neighborhoods? What's one thing, one small thing that they can do to foster community and democratic possibility?
I think, having questions more than judgments, asking and vocalizing questions and connecting with your words or connecting with your actions. My neighbor, he always puts my trash out, puts it to the curb. He always makes sure I'm okay. That sense of belonging with just anticipating your neighbor's need and seeing if anyone needs help, and how you could do these gestures or just conversations and check-ins of their humanness, yeah, that's how I would go about it. And life is good and life is beautiful. And when we have that perspective, that is what we see. And so it does start within.
Yeah, I mean, that Blue, that's really making me. I'm so glad that you said that, because it was also during COVID, like maybe in the months just right as the pandemic was gearing up, or maybe April, late March, April. Like, my family and I, we moved to a different neighborhood, and of course we didn't know anybody, right? And even though we were all inside, our grass was still growing. In Memphis it's hot and your grass is going up, and I didn't have a lawnmower. And I remember going and asking my neighbor, like, yo, could I borrow your lawnmower, so I could cut my grass until I get a lawnmower? And my neighbor was like, I'll do you one better. Like, I will just have my son come over there and cut your grass, And I was like, man, she didn't have to do that, right? Like, she didn't have to. There was nothing. She didn't know me from any. I had just moved into the community. And so I'm so echo what Blue is saying about just being a good neighbor. Like, we don't have the front porch anymore. Most of us don't, right? And so that's not necessarily an opportunity to interact with neighbors. But I just think about what it's like to be a good neighbor, and then to try to compound that effect with, okay, if the two of us know each other now, could we bring a third person into the mix? And I just wonder, like, how stronger our neighborhoods would be. I'm thinking about the loneliness report that the Surgeon General published a couple years ago, and so much of that was talking about just how many of us have just lost connections just with our neighbors, right? Like, we don't know our neighbors. And so I'm really resonating with that. It's like an act of civic action that we can all take, regardless of, if we work in a library or a park, or we visit the library or the park. Just what we could do as a neighbor, I think, is a really wonderful thing, to provocative sort of thing that we could all start with.
I love that. I love you've got me thinking about the front porch completely differently now. I thought it was just a place to sit and gaze out upon the horizon. I'm like, oh, I'm supposed to talk to people? Yes, of course. And to acknowledge, right? And to acknowledge. And I love this. And I love that, yes, institutions, coffee shops, but also wherever you are is an opportunity to be curious about the democratic possibilities and to practice those democratic skills. And so I think those opportunities are there. But the work at Everyday Democracy has really been around ensuring that we are providing people with a container to do that. And that requires, skills. You know what else is annoying? Time is running out. And we've had such an incredible conversation. So I do want to first thank you, Shamichael. Thank you, Blue. Thank our incredible panelists for your insight. To all of you out there listening who are still here, and those who have left us, for the thoughtful questions and for being a part of the conversation today. At Everyday Democracy, as I said in the beginning, we believe in dialogue. We believe that, being committed to helping communities move from conversation to action is essential to building the democracy that we want to live in. And so we want to leave you with a few concrete ways to do that. And also, what you can do next. So now, by now, we should have a slide here on the screen. Yes, we do. Actions you can take today. Start with a conversation, right? And we have for you all some healthy tips that you can use for some tips for healthy conversation in divided times. And that will be shared also with the recording for all the folks who joined us today. But create moments of connection, even informally, right? Say hello to someone, post a question on a bulletin board, right? Have small gatherings, take a neighborhood walk, but just some way of committing to building trust, belonging, and civic possibilities. And then connect with local organizations, right? So, go to the local community spaces, gardens, mutual aids, libraries, nonprofits, right? And bring a friend, volunteer, do something, coach a team, walk a neighbor, an elderly neighbor, to where they need to go. Go support them and get groceries. Talk to somebody at the local farmers market if you have one. There's so many ways that we can be engaged and connected with one another in the smallest and simplest of ways. So as I said, you'll all receive a follow-up email with the recording, as well as resources and more information about ways to connect with both of our speakers and some of the books that we brought up. As a reminder, Everyday Democracy partners with individuals and grassroots organizations and institutions, and we'd love to work with you. So please feel free to stay connected, and you'll, check out our newsletter as that comes up. We'll be having more conversations coming up in the year, and we hope you'll join us again. But I do want to just leave you with this recognition. Democracy doesn't just happen in the halls of power. It happens wherever people gather. It happens in the park. It happens on our porches. It happens at our library tables. It happens at our cafe counters. Civic spaces are where we practice the future together. Thank you all so very much for your time, for your energy, your questions, and we are so fortunate that you joined us. And thank you again to Blue and Shamichael and to the whole EVDIM team that made our event possible today. Thank you so much and have a beautiful rest of the evening.